Rock's not dead, but it kind of is. I assure you all, like, this is not bait or a hot take for its own sake. This is something that I've thought about for a very long time as a lover of rock and a player of rock. Rock is the music that raised me. It's musically where I come from. It's what's influenced me for the longest. As a disclaimer, like, of course, I don't claim to know every scene, every band, every development in all the spheres of rock all over the world. I'm gonna talk general observations here as I've made them in the US, which is where I live. If you don't know me, I'm Sezno. I'm a 25-year-old Japanese-American songwriter, composer. I make 21st century punk and pop music. Rock is in a weird place right now. In the last few decades, rock's cultural presence has changed in such a way that there are lots of people now who would earnestly tell you that rock is dead. I'm gonna argue that this is not true, but what is true is that, again, rock's cultural presence has changed greatly in the 21st century, which we're now a quarter of the way through, and the genre is no longer where it was. And I'm gonna argue that a deliberate ignorance of that cultural change by both musicians and consumers has unintentionally dug the genre deeper and deeper into a hole. The elephant in the room is that rock is not at the top of the charts anymore. I looked up the Billboard charts for early 1975, which is 50 years ago this year. There were top 10 albums by Elton John and Yes, Jethro Tull, two of the former Beatles. I'm not gonna fixate on this for long, but obviously, like, that is not the world that we live in anymore. The figures that we admire culturally, the figures who are making music now, who we look to for important work, the people whose life stories are blueprints for the young and the hungry. For millions of us today, those people don't come from the sphere of rock. Or at least not exclusively rock, because rock doesn't have anywhere near a monopoly on culture. Of course, you could say to me, how could rock possibly be dead or dying when you still have bands and listeners all over the world in droves? And streaming has made it possible for younger generations to discover this music, and it's happening every day. And Smells Like Teen Spirit has been streamed 2 billion times. I earnestly believe that the problem is a lack of innovation, at least recently. And this lack of innovation has comparatively only been a problem really in the 21st century. What I have observed as a participant in rock over the last 10 years, most new rock bands these days, they forge a sound from a particular style of rock from somewhere in its history, and they generally play that style conservatively. This applies to successful bands as much as, like, modest local bands that I've shared bills with over the years. You have your shoegaze bands and your hardcore bands and your slowcore bands and your post-punk bands. These are all styles from rock history that at this point are very well defined. And if you're familiar with those styles, you probably imagined a sound in your head as soon as I brought them up. Like, I could say post-punk band, and like you would know what I'm talking about. There's a list of things that you would expect to hear in that music, and you would probably get them. We all love these styles, and of course, I would never begrudge a musician from playing a style that they love. But the wider result, I think, has been stunted growth for the genre as a whole, which, importantly, has not always been the case. This is a relatively new problem. The lack of wider innovation these days is at the crux of my argument here, because in rock's heyday, which is the 20th century, what you had is this absurd historical through line of just continuous innovation for decades. From the 50s all the way to the turn of the century, you had new styles and sounds and unique new artists emerging all the time, and the definition of rock itself was changing year in and year out. Rockabilly, psychedelia, glam, prog, punk, early hardcore, Manchester, grunge. These were all hard cultural resets. It's all rock, but it's rock reinterpreted for the concerns of new demographics every time, as distinct from the rock that preceded it. This train of innovating, in my opinion, continues until around 2005 or so. Like American Idiot, Black Parade, first Arctic Monkeys album. These were, big rock records that were innovative. But after that era, in terms of large-scale developments in rock, in terms of style and songwriting, the innovative factor drops off noticeably. Like, as one example, right? Take the riff as a concept. Cornerstone of rock music, essential to understanding how rock music functions. Most of the classic riffs in rock were written a very long time ago. And I'm not even bringing metal into the equation here because I think comparatively metal is doing all right. Most rock fans could hum like a million riffs from the 1970s off the top of their head. But like, what's the most iconic riff of the 2010s? Do I want to know? To me, 20th century rock is more impressive than 21st century rock because the important bands of the 20th century, they weren't playing the same rock and roll that their parents were. It's not black and white, I know, but an idea loses power over time. Like, Blitzkrieg pop wouldn't mean the same thing if it came out today. It would still be hard, you know, it would still be a good song, but if it came out in 2025, it wouldn't mean the same thing as if you saw the Ramones play it at CBGB's in 1976. Like, imagine going to Woodstock and handing somebody a copy of the Germs album, which I have, by the way. Give me a B. That album came out 10 years after Woodstock, but that person at Woodstock would not understand that record. They may go as far as to say that it's not even music. It has a completely different perspective on rock and on life from the rock that was coming out just 10 years before. And much of the excitement from this record comes from the fact that it is so bold and fearless and innovative. It's different from what came before. It seems to say fuck the past entirely. This was their rock music. It was not their parents', and that's what made it important. Like, as another example, right? I love shoegaze as much as the next guy, but has anybody really topped Loveless? I'm not trying to be rude, but like, you know, has there been a game-changing record, a game-changing band that has expanded on the shoegaze of Loveless and tapped into something new and maybe even improved on Loveless or, you know, Souvlaki or whatever? There are hundreds of bands in America probably rehearsing right now that are still trying to make Loveless, and that album is going to be 35 years old next year. This is not just a shoegaze specific problem. I think it applies to lots of different subgenres. The other main example I think of is the emo revival of the 2010s, which was a great outpouring of lots of fresh new energy, lots of exciting new bands writing great songs. But stylistically, it wasn't that different from the emo and the pop punk, the Midwest emo of the 90s. It was a callback rather than something completely new and contemporary. I'm gonna move on to another factor that I think accounts for some of the stunted innovation in rock, and this relates to the consumers, actually. To the fans and the critics, the people who write about rock, and the people who have the cultural power to define rock and kind of set limits on what it is and what it isn't. I think currently, rock is influencing other genres more than it's influencing itself. People that say that rock has no influence anymore, they have no idea what they're talking about. This is clearly untrue, and like, you don't have to look very hard for proof. When Olivia Rodrigo or Billie Eilish have big electric guitars in their choruses, where does that come from? You can also hear plenty of remnants of rock in the SoundCloud rap of Lil Peep and XXX and Juice WRLD, who are some of the most influential artists in my lifetime. Hyperpop also couldn't exist in the same way without pop punk. And there are plenty of subgenres of electronic music that use distorted, heavy melodies that owe something to guitar riffs. Shit, like, rappers refer to themselves as rock stars these days. What more is there to say? But none of that stuff that is influenced by rock music is earnestly thought of by rock listeners as rock music. I think that what has happened is that now rock is multiple generations deep, and we've all culturally kind of come to an agreement on what rock is and what it is not. Like, you could make music that comes from a rock place, but stylistically, if you were to push it far enough in a given direction, it doesn't get called rock anymore. At what point did New Order stop being a post-punk band and become a synth-pop band? How many synths can you put in your music before that line is drawn? Also, how heavy can your riffs and your vocals be in your rock band before you're no longer a rock band but you're a metal band? The influence of rock is still here. We're surrounded by it every day. But rock is not thought of as innovative and as important these days because we're all too deeply set in our own definition of it, which doesn't have a place for developments in other genres. Like, there's a Lil Peep song where he just sings over Wonderwall, and we all know how much Liam and Noel love to talk about how rock and roll they are, but rock purists would heavily disagree with you if you earnestly referred to Lil Peep as a rock artist. Rock used to be concerned with the new, but increasingly it is judged according to how well it replicates and conforms to the old. And the genre's importance has suffered as a result. And of course the question becomes, like, what is the solution then? What's gonna happen to rock? I don't think rock is gonna go away anytime soon in terms of people playing it and the love of certain styles, and people will continue to pursue them, I think. But in terms of rock's involvement in the history of like musical form and musical style, it's probably gonna be a constituent ingredient and influence in numerous 21st century styles of music that we don't have yet. And I think guitar music is going to change as a result. And there's gonna be music that is not strictly rock, and the purists may never think of it as rock. But the ideas and the techniques and the general songwriting philosophies of rock will be reinterpreted and transplanted into this new music, whatever it may be. I think we haven't seen the full potential of rock interacting with hip-hop. I see my own music as kind of contributing to that discourse a little bit. We might be past the point where rock is strictly rock. I don't know if there are other discoveries to be made according to the definition of rock that we've all assigned. Because not much has happened recently in terms of strictly rock. Again, there are great bands and great scenes and great songs being written all the time. I'm glad that they exist and they should continue to exist. But I feel like culturally we should accept that if you play rock, you kind of play 20th century music. You can do that if you want. There are tons of people that still play jazz, and that's a 20th century form. But the rock world needs to get comfortable with the idea that increasingly we're kind of a victim of like museum culture. We've had an amazing, rich tradition, the important contributions to which are starting to be a couple decades ago now. And, you know, the solution is not, let's bring this style back. It has to be assimilated into other kinds of music that are new and exciting and contemporary and relevant to right now. You can use those influences, but it doesn't make sense really to write songs from 1975 all over again, because it doesn't mean the same thing. Anyway, I know I gave a lot of hot takes here. These are just observations that I have. Again, I love rock. I care deeply about it. I know its history very deeply. This is just where I see us as being right now. And if you, as the viewer, have any insight, any interesting things to observe, I would love to hear about it. I would love a discourse on this. Because I'm not intending to be mean-spirited here. But I think our generation need to kind of reimagine guitar music and guitar songwriting in light of all these developments that have occurred, because we'll get left behind, you know? I think I'm okay with the jam bands dying though. Let's just move on past that. Cheers, love you all. Check out my music.